legal challenges could create this delay and uncertainty. Katie, I want to start with you. What would that mean for the atmosphere on November the 6th, the day after the election?
I mean, for a start, we don't really need to use our imaginations too much here, because we can look at what happened the last time. And what we saw was it taking 4 days to know for sure who the winner was. And in fact, we know from a recent court filing that Donald Trump had planned, regardless of what was happening, to declare victory. He understood, and it's perhaps important to take a step back and just remember the conditions that election were taking place in. You know, this was the height of the pandemic. A lot of people were voting by mail, and particularly a lot of Democrats were voting by mail. And Donald Trump well understood that the picture would shift. So you had what people described as this red mirage, where the early returns looked really strong for him, but the more votes that were counted, and particularly the more mail ballots that were counted, the more that started to shift towards the Democrats. So he came out in the early hours of the morning and declared victory, knowing full well that the counting wasn't even finished yet, and fully expecting to inject confusion into that process. Now, what we saw then was quite reactive. The Trump campaign seemed really to be building their case as they went along. They mounted a lot of legal challenges, which went absolutely nowhere, and which they were unable to show any credible evidence in courtrooms. But the point seemed to be to inject this uncertainty, to claim that this election was being stolen, and to claim that this delay, the time that it's taking to count all of these votes, is evidence that something nefarious is going on. So I think you can expect to see that happen again, but with a lot more organization behind it. And what you had on the other side then was the Biden team and Joe Biden himself coming out at intervals and saying, you know, folks, bear with us. This is what this process looks like. This doesn't mean anything bad is happening. Democracy can be messy. Votes are being counted. Let's stand aside and let's let the election workers do their jobs. And when then it came down to Pennsylvania on the Saturday, I think it was November 7th, declaring the result and Biden being predicted as the winner, you know, the Democratic side of the argument was just, this is what this process looks like. Bear with us. The system has gone through its necessary processes, and now we have the result. But I think you're going to see this time, you know, this is going to be phenomenally close. I think that's the only thing anyone can predict with real certainty about this election. It's going to come down to tens of thousands of ballots in 7 swing states. We may well see recounts and contestation from both sides. But I think on the Trump campaign side, there will be an attempt really to use that, to seize that as evidence that, you know, they've been preparing the ground here since the last election, that once again, we are seeing an election being stolen out from under us. And I think the real concern is whether that translates then into physical actions, and whether we see that move beyond rhetoric, beyond, you know, into the realms of Trump calling his supporters out onto the streets and out, you know, outside of the poll stations where these processes are happening and votes are being counted.
You asked a question about whether delays in elections would discredit or lead to potential violence within the country. It's very typical. The data will show that across countries, not just in the US, that delays are typically associated with unrest following elections, and unrest typically taking protests in the street that can turn violent. And that is because the delay, as Katie said, is used as evidence of discrediting the process, and that is an opportunity for them to be cheating, and that the delay is due to cheating in voting. And so we would expect, if the US follows the general trends, that would be the case in the United States. And as Katie also said, when elections are competitive, there is also much more likely to be violence. So the closer the election, the more likely there is to be violence, because the opposition will think that they could have won the elections with those few counts being switched.
I mean, do you think it is a serious risk that Donald Trump, as Katie suggested he planned to last time, would come out in the period after the election and declare victory, whether he was successful or not, depending on that early voting?
Absolutely. Based on all of his behaviors and promises to do so ahead of time, that it will absolutely be the case. And that will stoke among supporters desires for protests that could turn violent and other actions. I will say the U.S. is much more prepared than it was in the previous elections to be on alert, to follow the intelligence, and to avoid the similar level of violence that was prosecuted in the last election. And so I would expect that there would be violence, but at a much more limited level due to the high rule of law and our policing system.
Katie, you were talking about how last time Joe Biden's team said this is part of the process, we've got to wait it out. I mean, this time I think we know that Kamala Harris's legal team is 10 times larger than Joe Biden's. Is there more preparation? Do you think they might have a different response this time? It could be more combative.
I think they have to be more prepared. I mean, I think what we saw last time, this time it would still be shocking, but it wouldn't be surprising. This has been, as Dawn said, this has been very well advertised in advance. At every single one of Trump's rallies now, he is saying, the only way we lose this election is if it's stolen. I hope that this election is fair. I hope it's peaceful. But the only way that we lose is if it's not. So it would be, I guess, malpractice for the Harris campaign not to be really well prepared to at least meet the legal side of this. I mean, what we saw last time was really the system work as it's intended. It is right and fair that candidates in an election, if they feel that there has been some irregularities, that there has been something that wasn't fair, they are able to go to a impartial, fair court system. They're able to show their evidence, mount their challenge, have their case heard fairly and fully, and then have a judge rule. And that's what happened. I think there were 60 odd cases last time around. In not a single one of them was Trump successful. But it's right and fair that he should have the ability to mount those challenges in court. And it's right and fair that the Harris campaign should do the same. But what I think, the learning that has happened over the last 4 years, as Dawn said, we now have come to expect this level of contestation. The certification of the results in the Congress on the 6th of January, that is now designated a national security special event, the same as the inauguration. These events that we previously just expected to follow the process, to follow the norms that have been established over centuries, we now understand that that won't necessarily happen. So, the law enforcement side of that is going to be ready. And I think the legal arm of both campaigns has to be ready, because I think this time you're going to see, the Trump campaign has talked about the number of poll watchers, for instance, that they are recruiting. They hope to recruit more than 100,000 people to go around the country to stand and watch in the areas that that's designated, and to try to find evidence of anything that could be an irregularity that can then be part of a court case that can then, lead to a more successful legal side of this campaign. So there's been real preparations to do this and to take this to the courts. And I think that, the Democratic side of that equally has a very large legal team and is prepared for those challenges. I think the real uncertainty here is what happens beyond that. If you have a really large number of people who believe and are being told and are, hearing from the former president and his vice presidential nominee, J.D. Vance, there's no indication that this time he is going to perform the role that Mike Pence did last time of being the voice of saying, let's pursue the legal challenges and then let's take a bow and then let's concede and let's democracy take its course. I think there's every reason to believe that J.D. Vance is on that ticket because he has shown he's going to put his loyalty to Donald Trump above all else. So I think what also may be lacking this time is a little bit of the voices of restraint on the Trump campaign side. People have already taken sides here. And I think that could feed into this really febrile atmosphere in those, it may well be days. I think the narrative that we should be making sure that people are prepared for ahead of this election is that it doesn't mean that something has gone wrong. It's normal that this is going to take time, and that if people are declaring, the red herring is if people are able to declare victory while votes are still being counted. But it is going to be really difficult in a country that is now so divided along these partisan lines to make that case calmly.
In addition to the Trump campaign, there are also foreign influence campaigns that are also not only favoring certain candidates, but just trying to stoke instability within the country by claiming and discrediting the elections. And so the U.S. national intelligence officials have warned that they are very active, and more so than last time, in trying to discredit our electoral process. And they expect that to be not only before, but after. Even though the Democrats leaders are not stoking similar rhetoric among the population, we could expect independently voters to engage in violence in a smaller scale than if the election is close and they feel cheated, given the environment that we are posed. So they might be acting independently at a smaller scale level than in the Democrats. So it could be on both sides.
What we've been alluding to here is this risk of political violence. I mean, does this question of delay and questioning naturally go hand in hand with violence?
It is a commonly trend that the delays in elections do lead to violence, typically from protests among the population, seeing the delay as a time period in which they're using to corrupt the elections. It also allows leaders to stoke that delay in the period afterwards, that opinion. And so I would expect that to be the case.
I mean, is there any effective way of preventing that, knowing that there may be this long period, possibly up until January, where there will be this uncertainty?
Well, first is from the responsibility of leaders, which we won't have on the Trump side, but from the Democrat side, as well as other government bureaucracy, saying that this delay is typical, it's expected, this is a part of the democratic process, it is a legitimate process. That's one avenue. The other avenue, of course, is a strong rule of law and police protection out in the street looking and prepared for this, as well as combating it via intelligence beforehand.
So, Katie, last week on the Politics podcast, you mentioned that democracy wasn't a top 3 priority for the American electorate. What does that mean for this period where there will be questions about democracy?
So I think it is a top 5, but it's not the top. It's important. And I think the unknown is for how many people that is the decider. You know, you see high profile Republicans like Liz Cheney now out campaigning for Kamala Harris because this is the issue that has pushed her over the edge. And I think we saw in the Republican primaries, you know, there is a not insubstantial number of Republicans who now cannot stomach Donald Trump. The question is how that translates to votes on the election day, whether people's partisan identities win out, whether people sit it out, or whether, you know, I think one of the sort of most dismaying aspects of this is that this time people can't say they didn't know. You know, in 2016, there was a reasonable case you could make that, you know, Donald Trump was an outsider. He was new to politics. You didn't necessarily know what was going to follow. I think the alarming thing for a lot of people here is if Donald Trump is reelected as president of the United States, it will be in the full knowledge that he is somebody who has tried to overturn the results of an American election, who has been convicted of felonies, who has been found liable for sexual assault. You know, all the things that used to be shocking and you used to perhaps be able to say that we wouldn't know what would follow. Now people will be voting for him in the full knowledge that that is who he is, but that they want him, regardless. I think the other thing that I would just add to Dawn's excellent comments is I think the other danger in terms of the risk of political violence here is the broader loss of trust in public institutions. That's not just the executive branch, that's also Congress, and it's also the Supreme Court. You know, I lived abroad for a lot of years. I lived in Russia and China, and I used to always be able to talk about, you know, yes, there's a lot wrong with British and American politics, but one of the great things about our systems is the fair and independent judiciary. You know, somebody can't just take your business or take your land or commit a crime against you without having recourse. You have that independent, that the third branch of government here is so essential and was previously so well respected. But I think we've also seen that take a hit. And I think that's the risk. Once people stop having faith in the independence of these institutions and start to see, you know, even the Supreme Court as being politicized, as advocating for one side or the other, then that's where the danger is that people decide they have to take matters into their own hands.
I would add that even though democracy is not a top factor that people are considering in their voting process, polls show, very concerned that violence will result in a tight election or a competitive election, or if Trump doesn't win, on both sides. And so even though they're not voting on it, they're quite concerned about the outcome for democracy in the United States as a result of these elections.
I think one of the strands is this idea that it's going to be because non-citizens are voting. I think that could be a very ugly strand of this, is the idea that it's not just like last time it was so much about the mechanism and the voting machines and Dominion. This time there is this like very well-seeded conspiracy at this point that it's because that Harris and Biden are conspiring to open the borders, allow all these non-citizens in to vote, which obviously is illegal. But I think that sets up a potentially very nasty element where people are going to be challenged about, are you a citizen of the United States? What's your right to vote? And I think there could be a real racialized element to it that could get nasty.
I would add that it's unlikely that it's just going to be around the election period, that racialized hatred of other groups will end up with individuals on the street attacking, criticizing, harassing anyone who seems to be a foreigner. Because we know under the presidency, when he criticized the COVID virus as the China virus, there's an uptick of individuals attacking and bothering, harassing Chinese people or anyone who looked Chinese, and that his comments about migrants often led to an increase in hatred crimes against migrants just by individuals who are inflamed by his comments. And so it won't only affect the election, but it will affect individuals who have unrelated to the election and the fabric of U.S. society.
In the middle of this whole period of delay, of course, Donald Trump is due to be sentenced in this New York trial on the 26th of November. How does that play into this? You've created this whole period of uncertainty, of delay, of, heightened tensions. And then there's this key moment within potentially that window.
So if the sentencing happens, which is questionable because it could be delayed, Trump will use it as a opportunity to say that it is a hunt after him and to prevent him from running an election. So it would stimulate further instability and a polarized nature of the political system.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's already really trying to present himself as a political martyr, as a political prisoner. I would probably be surprised if that does go ahead in this environment. I think we've already seen, I think the judge in the case is aware of the political consequences, and I think that would be extraordinarily inflammatory. He would say that he is a political prisoner, and he would certainly, I think, in that case, call his supporters out onto the streets.
Are there any notes of optimism here?
We are better prepared and a stronger rule of law, and so I don't think we will have the level of one big violent event as we did in the previous time, that we will have violent events in different areas because it's impossible to predict and be there on every occasion. But I'm hopeful that it will not be at the level that it was in the previous election, but that it will still have violent events throughout.
The other sort of note of optimism is, the last time around, under extraordinary pressure, individuals who are not famous, who are not big names in Republican or Democratic politics, did their jobs and certified the results in the face of real, personal threats, in terrible situations. Lots of people did their jobs in a really admirable way. So I think that, the optimistic note is that, yes, this time this would not be a first. People know what could happen. And I think, we hope that individuals will once again be the key in making sure that that the system holds, that this does go off better than everyone's expecting, and that that we're wrong to be as concerned as I think so many people really are at the moment.